In the meantime, I will now turn it over to Suzanne.
Needless to say, one has to be slightly crazy to come to the hometown of a person as well known as Jane Addams, because everyone here has a story or a belief or a thought about Jane Addams. So when Jim first asked me to come, I thought, you know, it was such a long time ago, I never even thought it would be a problem. But it began to be quite a going back to school and doing a lot of research, and then finding that it was very difficult to decide what things would be the things that would be good in a program, because there was so much to say about all three of these ladies. But Jane was the focal point of Hull House, and it was very hard at first when I first began portraying Jane Addams. I was doing it at the Peace Park in Rockford. On Friday, I will once again portray Jane at the Peace Park for about 1,000 area third graders. And during that morning from 9 until noon, several of us, Jane will be one of the people, but children will come into the tent where we are situated, and we will give a 15-minute talk about why the person was involved with the peace movement. And for a long time, I was mostly thinking and reading about Jane and her Hull House years before the First World War. I wasn't really involved in the part of it that was really the big part of her life. Not to say that the other parts weren't very important, but in thinking about it seriously and really examining it, Jane's biggest task was after when the First World War was coming along. And so tonight I've sort of thought about this in 4 different parts. And so I will just talk to you as Jane, telling you about these parts of my life. Well, I was born September 6th, 1860, Laura Jane Addams. I was born to Sarah Weber Addams and John Addams. I adored my father. I was born the same year that Abraham Lincoln ran for President of the United States. And my father was a close and personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. My father called me Jenny as a child, and I was the 8th child of the family. Father served 16 years in the state legislature, directed a bank and a railroad, and several grist mills around the Freeport area. As a child, I suffered from a terrible inferiority complex, and I had a crooked back. So I walked slightly with my head to one side, but I was precocious and an introspective child. I often went to work with my father. I enjoyed being at his side, although I know he must have been ashamed of me because I thought I wasn't a very attractive child. I went with him on several occasions, and I noticed that other people didn't live in big houses like the house we lived in. And I decided when I grew up, I would build a nice house in the middle of all the little houses so everyone could come and play in my yard, because so many of those children that lived in the small houses seemed to be poor and didn't have yards to play in. My mother died shortly after giving birth to a child. She had been helping a neighbor and fell and lost the child and left me a 2-year-old child. My sister Martha, my older sister, began to raise the rest of our children, and I started public school in a 2-room school. Now Martha introduced the family to a lady named Anna Hunter. And when my sister Martha was attending Rockford Female Seminary, she died of typhoid fever. And Anna helped with the family, and my father married Anna. And I gained 2 new brothers, George and Harry. Now, when I got to the age of graduating from high school, I had decided that I was going off to Smith College out east. I wanted a bachelor's degree. Well, my father was one of the trustees of the Rockford Female Seminary, and 3 of my sisters had already gone to school there. So naturally, even though I wanted to go east to Smith College, I attended Rockford Female Seminary. I did well at Rockford, but I have to say, I wasn't always cooperative. Anna Pexill was principal of Rockford Female Seminary, and it was her plan that all of us that attended the seminary would be missionaries or married missionaries. And so she had an all-out pressure to baptize me, and my father had been a Quaker, and I had decided just because Miss Sill thought I should be baptized was really not a good enough reason. I was not baptized at Rockford Female Seminary. It was later, in 1888, that my sister's husband, a Presbyterian pastor, baptized me over in Winnebago. I graduated from Rockford Female Seminary, but I stayed an extra year so that I could get one of the first bachelor's degrees that would be in Rockford College by then. And at that first year that I was at Rockford College, and I should tell you about that, I met my 2 lifelong friends, Ellen Gates Starr and Julia Lathrop. Ellen went 1 year to Rockford Female Seminary, and then went to Mount Morris to teach 1-room school, and then on to Chicago to teach. And Julia went 1 year to Rockford, and then she went east. She was hoping to get a law degree. Well, my health was never very good. And after I graduated, I, of course, decided that I wanted to go to medical school. George had already gone east to medical school, my stepbrother. And there was some discussion between my stepmother and my father that perhaps George would make a very good husband for me. And George and I were very good friends, but I had no interest whatsoever in getting married. And so George was off to medical school, and I went off, I thought, to medical school. But my father died unexpectedly of a ruptured appendix while on vacation. He died, which was a terrible blow to me and the rest of the family. And I was ill, not doing well in school, came back home and spent some time at home. And then it was felt that I should take a 2-year trip to rest and recover to Europe. And Toynbee in London, England. Kind of passed that by at that time, but he was always in the back of my mind. Came back home, and my back trouble was pretty serious. And so after I had recovered from some more resting at home, I think my stepmother kind of thought, since I wouldn't marry George, that I should be the elderly auntie that would kind of look after the little nieces and nephews, because my sisters and my brother had married, and they thought that that would be a good place for me. I had no plans of being the auntie that would stay home. So I decided, my father had left me some money in his estate, and so I decided to take another trip to Europe. Not with my stepmother this time, but with a group of friends, and particularly with my friend Ellen Starr. So we spent some time. Ellen left her job temporarily in Chicago. She was teaching in a girls' school in Chicago, art classes and Latin, and she took a sabbatical to follow me, to travel with me. I paid her way as my companion. She was delighted to be able to go to all those wonderful places in Europe that had the wonderful art museums and the wonderful cathedrals. And we traveled all the way, had a bad experience in Spain watching a bullfight. Never very fond of sports such as that, but also kind of an epiphany. I began to think, after we had gone through many of the capitals of the world and seen the poverty in so many places in the world, and wasn't there something that could be done about that? Kind of reminded me of my childhood when I had spent time going to the factories with my father. So we traveled back to London and visited Toynbee Hall, more seriously this time. And I was trying also to encourage Ellen to give some thought to the idea of a settlement house. The settlement house was a brand new idea. College students that came together to work in poverty areas to teach the language and the everyday living to the people that were immigrants coming in to London from all over the world. Ellen thought it was a pretty good idea. So we decided when we came back home that we were going to find a place in Chicago. Had a very big immigrant population coming in at that time. Now understand, we were women who had education and were told that we really needed to get married. We were of the time and the place in the world that it was our responsibility to get married, have a child, have children, have a home for our husbands who would be the breadwinners of the family. And neither one of us was the least bit interested in getting married. We wanted to have a career, and you could not have a career if you were a married lady. And so we had decided, quite frankly, at that time, and I was 29 years old at that time, deciding that it was time to really do something serious. So we were going to look for a place in Chicago, and I found one on Halsted Street and Polk in Chicago. Worst part of the city. Terrible slum area. There was a wonderful old estate in the midst of all of that, built by a man by the name of Charles Owens. And it had come to disrepair in this area, as often happens when the city moves into an area and the immigrants come in so quickly and live in tenements, and housing is so bad. And we talked to the niece of Mr. Powell to see if we could rent an apartment or some rooms. And she was so pleased with the idea of a settlement house in Chicago that she let us use the whole building. And it became kind of an interesting project. Of course, it was the slums, and Chicago had some really serious problems at the time. Fortunately, I had my father's, my inheritance from my father. Ellen had been teaching, still continued to teach, and she began to have some contacts that were going to be very important to our future. Lawyers and doctors' families who had daughters in the school where she taught. Well, what do you do? How do you start? We started with kindergartens. We started with group meetings, teaching English to the immigrants, teaching health, how to take care of your health. Their water situation was terrible. There was garbage everywhere in the streets, trying to teach a little bit about how to prevent illness. Children were dying of simple measles and whooping cough and illnesses that children shouldn't die of in a cleaner environment. And we had a lot of people coming to us, asking us for help. We would trying to find work for people, trying to find ways to simply manage to get along in the new country that they had come to. I helped to investigate about the lead poisoning that some of the homes were having. Milk supplies were bad, sanitary conditions. I did get a paid position, my only paid position, as garbage collector around Hull House, paid position. So I went around, started picking up trash around Hull House and teaching my neighbors how much better their lives would be if they would collect rather than throwing the garbage out the window or throwing the pale dirty water out the window, to pick up after themselves and clean around the area and find that children would survive longer. But I also, along with that, began to pull in other educated people, primarily women that we've known in school, but had particular talents. Julia came to hear us give a talk at Rockford College. She and her father came one evening when we were giving a lecture and asking for funding for our work. She was so inspired that she decided to join us at Hull House. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do. She said she'd been working in her father's law office as his law clerk, and actually she had the equivalent of a law degree, and women could not practice law in Illinois at that time. So she wanted to use her talents. So we asked her, she said no, she asked, what is it I can do? Well, I didn't tell people what they should do. I simply said, use your talents, use your abilities, find out what needs to be done. And that was generally what I often said to people. Well, she started a class. She taught some classes in the beginning, and then she began to see some of the problems that we had around the area. Children working long hours in the factories, women working long hours in the factories, and the kind of conditions in these places. She said that she discovered that in the mental hospitals, children were in the same wards as adults in mental facilities. She eventually visited 107 mental hospitals and homes across Illinois, one by one, to find out what the conditions were. So we found in our neighborhood Italian and German and Jewish people, all residing in the inner core. And then we had Greeks and Irish and Canadians and French in other parts just around us. I started to have speaking engagements in different parts of the state and then different parts of the country. Some people thought what we were doing was exciting and wonderful. Other people, Julia and I had a problem with one group of people because there were some immigrant girls coming in and were looking for work as housekeepers or maids, and they were being met by gentlemen who wanted to employ them in the white slavery business. And so we discouraged that, and we were not appreciated because of our desire to stop that particular trade. I began to talk to women about education and the importance of providing social and educational opportunities to working class people. That was a new thought. Many people felt 8th grade was as far as anyone should go. And the thought of being able to go all the way through high school and even consider a college degree was very far in some people, in some idea in the future. I was the first president of the National Conference of Charities and Corrections. So through Julia's interest, I was happy to head up some of these activities that she was involved in. I was given an honorary degree at Yale in 1910. Made me very happy, especially since I was not able to attend an Eastern college as I had hoped to do. And then I campaigned for Teddy Roosevelt and his Progressive Party. I was the second nominee for him. And then in 1915, I began to start a whole new phase of my life, and one that would be fascinating for me and frightening for me, and yet I really felt that it was the direction that I should go in. I was part of the Women's Peace Party. I was very opposed to a war that had come to Europe. I was very concerned about the United States perhaps getting involved in a war. And I had already become aware of what was happening in Europe. Women and children were starving to death. People were being moved across out of their own countries into other places, not taken care of, and the kind of terrible situations that one can only imagine. And I had become a very close friend of President Wilson. So naturally, hoping and praying that we could remain neutral in war, we dearly did, and many people supported what we were doing in the peace movement. I was president, I was leader of the Pacifist Solution Committee, president of the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. But unfortunately, the Lusitania was bombed, and we were inevitably going to be involved. I stood my ground. I stood my ground strongly. Mr. Ford got a ship ready for us to go to The Hague and protest, and of course we were turned back. I was said to be impossible pacifist. I wasn't getting fair hearings in the newspaper. I would take a train to give and the train would be stoned passing by. I believed from what we had done at Hull House in the years as we got up to 1915, that you can sit down and talk about a situation, no matter how big your differences, and work out a solution that would be comfortable for both sides. I really believe that. Of course, I haven't mentioned to you that during these times of my life, I would have great depression. I suffered from depression partly because of my physical problems, but also just simply because of the stress of the work and trying to find the help that we needed. I also might mention that my brother-in-law operated on my back and straightened my back situation, which was very helpful. Didn't change my personal feeling about my image. I never became a beautiful woman, but that had never particularly been an important thing to me. My father had been such a handsome man. I had always wished I could have been his beautiful daughter, but he seemed to be proud of me when I was a child. The first Christmas of the war, the Pope made a futile appeal for stopping hostilities. We attempted a neutral conference in Europe, and there was a terrible food shortage throughout the world, and the war progressed. There was famine, pestilence, and terrible killing of people. And I was expelled from the Daughters of the American Revolution. Such a terrible problem. My family were descended from Revolutionary War soldiers. But the DAR felt, because I was not for the war, that I must really not be a very good daughter of the American Revolution. Herbert Hoover launched a massive campaign to teach Americans to economize food and grow victory gardens. I asked to help with this effort, although my health had been very badly affected by the stress of the time. Many of the people who had been supporters of my work at Hull House and our work at Hull House turned against us. We lost funding. My dear friend Ellen, always supporting me personally, but decided that it was important to support the war effort. All these things add up to a very, very difficult time. Following the war, many began to see what I had tried to do was the right direction to go in. Although my health had suffered so much, I had to take time away. And my dear Helen's health also had badly deteriorated and needed financial help. I was fortunate because my family, I had a family support and still support for my father's legacy. Julia, bless her heart, came from a family of 5 children. She was the eldest, and she had family support. She also, when she had worked in her father's law office, had invested money in some of the firms that she helped work with. And so she was able to support herself. She helped to write the labor laws and the children's labor laws, the court laws for juveniles. And she worked for the government in Washington after she left Hull House. She went home and retired to Rockford and lived with a sister in Rockford, and still became active in various activities, organizations helpful to women. I suffered a heart attack in 1926, and my health was never very good after that. I set up a plan to fund a small stipend for Ellen, because at that point in time, she had had surgery and was crippled as well in a wheelchair. And so she was living in a convent in New York, and we needed to provide some funding for her. And so several of us together, one place was we did have a monthly stipend from our home health clinic. So I think when you think of our lives and what we managed to accomplish during these times, I think one of the things I always noted, we had not wrecked railroads, nor corrupted legislators, nor done many unholy things that men have done. But then we must remember that we have not had the chance to do all of that. After I suffered the heart attack, I was in a hospital in Baltimore, and I was not able to go to receive the Nobel Prize in 1931. I was not well enough to go. Thrilled and delighted that the world could recognize that peace was something to give a prize about. Always a wonderful thought. Trying to put a life together, I supported the League of Nations. I was a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Association for Advancement of Colored People. There were many things that I had such a wonderful chance to be part of. And the fact of having a family that would let a woman who really wanted to be educated, the opportunity to be educated, as did Julia, as did Ellen. So many women did not have such an opportunity. And wondering so often where it will go in the future. If we will finally find peace and find that we should sit down and talk things over. My brother, George, my stepbrother George, called me a practical idealist. And the people that knew us called us the angels of Halsted Street. I think, in closing, it is right that I was brought back to my hometown because Cedarville was the place that was always home to me. No matter where I traveled in the world, it was my touchstone. So, in 1935, I died of cancer in Chicago, and I was brought back to my house. Comments? So much more could be said. Honestly, I have enough information for 2 hours. Friday, I'm going to have to say it in 15 minutes. But I have no idea how I'm going to do that.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
What happened to George?
He became a doctor, apparently. It said that of the family of it, all of those children, 2 sisters and a brother, and Jane, lived to old age, to grown to adulthood. So, 2 of the sisters, one of the sisters married Harry, but Jane did one married to yes.
Cedarville, the Fink family. And they grew up very close to your home. I'm not sure how many houses away, but she was always very, informative about that. And even the youngest of 16 kids, she was 88 and she passed away last year.
A lot of the information has to do with the political parts of it. And if you have a chance, do read the 20 Years of Hull House. Go back and follow all the things that she did trying to keep us out of the war. And the things that were said and done to her, pretty awful, really. And then finally coming around to, I really thought it was just me personally, chuckle, the DAR kicking her out. I thought, wow, and all the things she was going through at that particular time, that probably wasn't the most awful thing that happened. Thank you so much for letting me come.
Thank you very, very much. For those people who have been to all of the programs, all four of the programs with Andy, Deborah, and Suzanne, just remember this, that you have been the only people who have ever seen a program or a series of programs like this. Nowhere else do I know of any organizations where a program in all three, separate programs, in all three of the women, and also Andy's program which set the stage up. That has not been done anywhere else. Okay, so you've had a chance to see and to hear something that is really quite unique. Insofar as Jane Addams is concerned, up in our research library, which is just across the hall there, she wrote many, many books and many articles. We probably have 8 or 9, 10 of the books that she wrote. We also have, Lordy, let me think, at least a dozen biographies of Jane Addams. We do have 20 years at Hull House, and copies. We also have 40 years at Hull House. And one of the other books we have is 80 years at Hull House, which was written by Mary Lynn Bryan, who at one time was the director of the Hull House Museum. Mary Lynn Bryan is a member of the Cedarville Historical Society, who's in southeast down in the Carolinas. She has just completed her third book on Jane Addams. It's just about ready to come out. We have the first 2 copies here. We'll get a copy of the third one. These books are like this. I mean, it's like reading War and Peace 3 times. And basically what it concentrates on are the documents and the writings that refer to Jane Addams. And so if you ever get a chance to do any more research on Jane Addams, we must have at least 30 to 40 publications in there that deal with